Thank you for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating session about potassium and phosphorus additives and how there might be a whole lot more that we need to know about just potassium and phosphorus additives. For our whole session today, we have Kelly Picard, who is a PhD RD with a passion for advancing nutrition and kidney care. With over 15 years of experience as a clinical dietitian, Kelly has dedicated her career to improving the lives of individuals with kidney disease through personalized nutrition strategies. She obtained her PhD from the University of Alberta, where, with her groundbreaking research focused on the impact of food processing on nutrition recommendations for individuals living with kidney disease. She continues to maintain an active clinical practice, blending her research insights with hands-on patient care to deliver evidence-based nutrition guidance. So, welcome, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's really nice to be here. Really nice, thank you for the planning committee to have invited me. I have no financial disclosures, although I make a joke that one day I'll know I'll have made it when I have some to declare. So I'm open if anyone in the room has any that they want me to engage in. So just my objectives. So we're going to be talking a lot. If we're going to talk about additives, we need to talk about food processing. So I'm just going to make sure we're all on the same page when I'm talking about different types of food processing. We're going to talk about bioavailability because that's a really important component when we're going to sort of deep dive into the additives in terms of what does that concept mean and how is that going to have an impact on our patients.
Sorry, I thought it was off.
And then I'm going to talk about the potassium and phosphorus additives, and this hopefully won't feel too nitty-gritty. I've shared my slides, so you can go back, because there's perhaps more information on the slides that we're going to get to, but this way you can always go back and take a look. And then we're also going to talk about the accuracy of potassium and phosphorus content reporting in ultra-processed food. And I'm Canadian, although fortunately our labeling laws and a lot of the legislation really overlaps between our two countries. So I've done my best to kind of dig through the American legislature as well. So we'll be kind of talking a little bit about what's happening there. And so in terms of food processing, one of the sort of best systems, or maybe the most popular system to describe the levels of processed food is called NOVA. NOVA's not an acronym, but it groups foods into 4 different categories. And so you can see there that we've got the minimally processed or the unprocessed foods. These are foods that look like a fruit or a vegetable, something that you can easily recognize. The processed culinary ingredients, these foods have had some level of processing because it's a bag of sugar or it's a jug of olive oil, but again, these are foods that have been part of human diets for a really long time, and you're using them to cook and prepare the level 1 foods. The processed foods are also foods that have been part of humans' diets for a really long time. Initially, they were likely kind of developed by humans to preserve our group 1 and group 2 foods. So those are things like cheese, wine would fall in there. A nice loaf of bread would also be potentially considered a processed food. But then we have this last category, and those are those ultra-processed foods. And these are foods that likely have ingredients that you don't find in a grocery store in your home kitchen. These are foods that may have undergone industrial processing that is beyond what you can do in your home kitchen. So you can can at home, you can process food at home, but you can't high-pressure extrude something in your own home. These foods also have additives, and in particular, when I'm thinking about kidney, I'm thinking about potassium and phosphorus additives. So that's sort of those categories there. And mostly, I'm going to be talking about ultra-processed food because by definition, once a food has an additive, it is an ultra-processed food. And this is just an example that this is American data, but Canadians were the same. We are behind you only by, you're first and we're second in terms of the worldwide consumption of ultra-processed food. And what this graph is showing you is that roughly between 50 and 60% of our calories come from ultra-processed food. That's that blue line there. And what I've always found really fascinating about ultra-processed food is income isn't protective. So you can see across the bars, their income is going up but the blue line isn't really changing. And so this is sort of one of these trends in nutrition that is sort of, I guess, bucking the trend, or it's changing. Because a lot of times we think about higher socioeconomic status being associated with perhaps better or healthier access to food. But in fact, what we're seeing is that ultra-processed food consumption isn't responding to income in the same way. And part of that has to do with marketing, and that they market ultra-processed food at every level. So I think like a really good example would be a boxed macaroni and cheese. So you have the no-name one for 29 cents. You have the brand name one, Kraft Dinner in Canada, probably here too. And then you also would have your high-level macaroni and cheese, like an Annie's Organic macaroni and cheese, if you have that brand. But basically, we've got brands and we've got targeting at every income level. So that's a really interesting part about nutrition, and we need to be really careful when we're counseling our patients that just because of their income doesn't actually mean that they're protected against consuming these foods. And so this is work that I did in my PhD, where we then started to look at, okay, well, we know what the general population is doing. What about people living with kidney disease? And what we found was actually very similar to the general population, 57% of the calories. And these were my patients. So these are patients that I see were coming from ultra-processed foods. And again, when we're kind of trying to tease out, so what is these ultra-processed foods? What are people actually consuming? And this trend actually is fairly consistent, is that it's breads, it's deli meat, reconstituted meat, it's cakes and cookies. You can kind of see there as it goes down. And keep in mind that bread is our most common source of ultra-processed food, because we're going to talk about why that might matter in a little bit when we're talking about the different types of additives, what foods have them, and which ones we're worried about. And so I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit, because the next concept that I want to make sure we're talking about or really have a good understanding about is bioavailability. And that's talking a little bit about how much of what we eat do we absorb. And so this is sort of a pre-test, if you will. So this is our first slide. And so we're talking bioavailability. And so I'm curious about in the audience, can you rank these? So which would you think would have the highest bioavailability of potassium all the way down to the lowest bioavailability of potassium? Okay, yeah, so you guys are doing a really good job. So yeah, so you're aware, so we've got these potassium chloride, the additives we think are likely the highest bioavailability. Then we have the liquids, which are going to have likely the next bioavailability, the canned mandarin. So we've had some modification. A lot of times they've removed that outer sort of husk on that mandarin. So we would assume that that's going to have next bioavailability all the way to the orange, which is minimally processed, still has all of its fiber and all of its cellular structures intact. We are going to think that that's going to have the lowest bioavailability of potassium. So you guys actually already know this, so I'm going to slide through. But basically, when we're thinking about potassium or even phosphorus, it's only the amount of potassium and phosphorus that leaves the gut and gets into the blood that can have an impact on the serum levels. So if somebody eats a whole bunch of potassium, but it never actually leaves the gut and it actually just gets pooped out, then that's not the potassium or phosphorus that I really care about for my patient. And when I'm trying to figure out when I've got a high potassium on my desk and I need to call somebody and that potassium is 5.7 and I'm gonna try to figure it out, I don't care about the amount of potassium that's left the toilet. Or I guess what I'm saying is that's not the potassium that's causing the problem. And so I'm trying to figure out which of these foods could people be eating that likely is leaving the digestive tract and hitting the bloodstream and then getting filtered through into the kidney. And so we have evidence, not great, and we don't really have a lot of individual foods, but we are starting to have some understanding about ways of eating and how these ways of eating are likely changing the potassium bioavailability. And so we don't really have a great measure of potassium bioavailability. So we don't really see in a lot of studies where they can like mark it or trace it. For example, like we radioactive an apple and get somebody to eat it and figure out where it's going. We're using sort of surrogate understanding or surrogate markers of the bioavailability. And a lot of times what that means is we're looking at the urine. So how much from when we know how much somebody's eating goes into the gut, is leaving the gut, going into the blood supply, getting filtered by the kidney, and then coming out in the urine. And we think that's the portion that's likely bioavailable, because that's the part that's sort of leaving the digestive tract. And so this was a study done by Naismith when they actually took other data and looked at it in a different way. And so they used the DASH diets, which were feeding studies, and compared what had happened to the potassium that was recovered. And so in the control diet, what they found was that 90% of the potassium was recovered in the urine, which suggests some pretty good bioavailability, whereas the DASH diet, which is higher in fruits and vegetables and pulses, only 62% of the potassium that was in that diet was actually recovered in the urine. And the original DASH trial actually had 3 arms, so they also had this third arm, which didn't have some of the other components of DASH, but they actually just really emphasized fruits and vegetables. And what you can see there is that had even lower potassium recovery, which suggesting even lower potassium bioavailability from this really high fruit and vegetable diet. And you can see here that the amount of potassium in those 2 diets, the 4,700 milligrams in both the DASH and the high fruit and vegetable, and then what the recovery was. This is another study, again, kind of in that same way, where they were looking at how does changing fruits and vegetables as part of a whole diet have an impact. And you can see that the more fruits and vegetables, so in this study, they got these people up to almost 12 servings of fruits and vegetable, and the potassium recovery was down to 54%. So again, sort of an example or a signal that more fruits and vegetables is associated with lower potassium bioavailability. This is the one and only intervention study that I've actually been able to find that's really investigated sort of a complex diet in terms of potassium. And so again, this was actually work done by Naismith, and he developed 2 diets, one that focused on highly bioaccessible or sort of proposed highly bioaccessible foods. So we've got more processed fruits like your orange juices you can see there. We've got white bread, we've got more meat, and then they compared it to the low bioaccessible diet, which was more whole grains, whole fruits and vegetables. And again, you can see that the low bioaccessible diet had lower urine recovery of potassium. So again, suggesting that it's these minimally processed fruits and vegetables that had less potassium bioavailability by lower recovery. But before we get really excited in all things in science, unfortunately, we don't have every single study agreeing with us. And so this was another study, although this was sort of more focused on sort of specific foods. So this was a study where they took potatoes and they compared it with potassium gluconate. And in this study, they actually reported higher bioavailability of their potatoes than the potassium gluconate, which actually is a little disappointing for me. My own bias is like, I want to save the potato, like let my patients eat potatoes, please. I want that to be low bioavailable. But I do think it's important that we understand that there's probably more going on here, and not every study has completely agreed that all fruits and vegetables are down at around 50 to 60%. That being said, here's another study that actually is with our hypothesis. And so this was a 16-day feeding study, and the potassium gluconate had higher urine recovery. So I guess I just let you know, I want you to know that we don't really know, and there are still some conflicts in the evidence. I'm going to switch now to phosphorus bioavailability, and it's a very similar sort of pathway that we're looking at in terms of measuring the phosphorus in the urine. And this is David St. Jules' work, who's actually in the room, so I better do a good job of explaining his work. But this was actually really cool work that their group did. They took a look at other studies, and again, we're sort of comparing how much phosphorus is being excreted in the urine. And you can see that in the vegetarian diet, the amount of the urinary phosphorus was 52%, and that meant 48% was unmeasured, compared to the meat diet, which had 72%, and about 30% was unmeasured. And this study that they were looking at, I think actually formed kind of the basis of, as a clinician, what we all are kind of acknowledging, and we're saying, oh, well, the plant-based food, bioavailability of phosphorus, 50 to 60%, the animals, probably closer to 70%, and then a lot of us say additives are up at 100. But David, you threw a wrench into this here too, didn't you? Because you also compared this other study, and you can see that that final column actually looked at additives, and you only found 54% phosphorus recovery from these additives. So again, I guess it just sort of suggests that there's likely a little bit more going on, and it's not quite as simple for us to say 100% of the phosphorus additives are being absorbed. And there may also be a little bit happening in terms of what's happening with our fruits and vegetables. And then one of the other things that I find myself kind of getting drawn into, because additives aren't necessarily the only concern with ultra-processed food, but also when we're talking about ultra-processed food, we also have, like I said, that high-pressure extrusion. We have all of these sort of processes happening in modifying our food. And my PhD faculty was actually in like the Faculty of Agricultural Sciences, and so I was doing a lot of my PhD seminars with food scientists, and they would get up and talk about their work and about how they were working to increase the bioavailability of things like phosphorus and get rid of the phytates and improve the quality of all of these grains. And I was sitting in that like room thinking like, don't do that. Like, I don't want that at all. Like, stop, leave the phytates. So it's just sort of really interesting. And so what we're seeing here is that these ultra-processed foods, maybe if they don't have additives, may actually still be more bioavailable than minimally processed food, even if we have the same food product, right? So we have bran, but bran that's been turned into an ultra-processed bran flake has had some decrease in the phytates, decrease in the tannins, which is leading to an increase in bioavailability of some of these minerals. And again, this is sort of another study where they were taking a look at the total amount of digestible phosphorus among different grains that had been sort of treated in different sorts of impacts. And again, they're sort of suggesting that if we process these grains, so even though it's a whole grain or a plant food, if we're processing it, we could be increasing the bioavailability of it. And so it's just sort of something for us to consider when we're looking at ultra-processed whole grains or grain products, even if it doesn't contain an additive, might still be more bioavailable than a minimally processed grain product. And so I guess just to summarize, why are we seeing some differences, and what's happening is that there's likely a lot of factors that are impacting the bioavailability of the minerals in our food. And it's likely not just as simple as saying that's a plant-based food and that's a fruit, that's a vegetable, that's an animal, or that's an additive. And so I've sort of tried to summarize that likely what we're seeing is that we see increases in bioavailability if we've got a single nutrient load. If it's liquid, the food matrix likely is easier for our body and our stomach to digest. We think there's likely a signal that additives and animal products are likely higher in bioavailability, and then of course the level of processing. So a minimally or a processed food will be more bioavailable than the other side of the unprocessed food. Okay, so with all of that background, we've got additives, we've got, let's go into additives because now we're talking about potassium specifically. And what do we know about potassium in this ultra-processed food? And so this again is starting to get a bit old, and it'll be interesting to see this get done, because this is work that I did using 2018 data from the USDA, where we looked at the prevalence of potassium additives in the branded product database, and we found that 15% of food products reported containing a potassium additive of at least some kind, although we only had potassium content reported in about 1% of those foods. So there's quite a sort of large unknown in terms of how much potassium was in these foods. We also had, just in general, whether it contained an additive or not, many foods didn't actually tell us. And so that's the biggest part of the pie. Although fortunately, the USDA branded product database contained almost 240,000 food items. So we were still able to take a look at what we did know with the remaining amounts. And so this is kind of just a summary slide that I have here for you that you may want to refer back to if you're wanting to kind of go through the nitty-gritty details. So I'm actually gonna talk about each of these in turn. So we've got 6 additives to dive into. And the reason that I think that this level of detail is important is we have made mistakes. I've made mistakes. I have been a dietitian long enough to have told my patients, you must stop eating bananas. And I think I at least feel like I've got a duty now, if I'm going to tell my patients new things, to do my best to get it right. And what I don't want to do is tell my patient not to eat something if it doesn't impact the mineral content of the food or has very little impact likely on the blood. My patients already have too few foods to eat. They already feel really restricted, especially those of them that have been in the game as long as I have or longer, where they've been taught all along that these fruits and vegetables, all these traditional diet restrictions, they can't have them. We're maybe trying to undo what we tell them, but it's really hard for them to let go. And the last thing I want to do is add more things onto the list that they can't eat when maybe they safely can. And so this is what really drove my work here in my PhD was I don't want to restrict foods that my patients can safely eat. And because there's so many different types of additives, I really wanted to have an understanding of are all of these additives problematic? And so we're going to focus on the most common additives that we were able to find. And so potassium sorbate is the most common potassium additive that's found in the USDA, that's found in European data. Interestingly, potassium sorbate is only 26% by weight potassium, which is actually probably a good thing for our patients because it means that the actual amount of potassium in that molecule likely is low. Evidence suggests, though, that potassium from potassium sorbate is well absorbed. And what this sort of graphic is showing is that when they traced or kind of looked for potassium, they were finding elements of it in the lungs. It's being exhaled. So if we think about that bioavailability slide that I showed you, if we can track it through different parts of the body, that suggests it's leaving the digestive tract and getting into different parts. So there's potential here for it to be contributing to the blood level because it's leaving the digestive tract. But one of the things that we need to consider is how much potassium sorbate is in the food, how much potassium sorbate are our patients actually consuming. And this is data from the European Food Safety Authority because they are, I think, ahead of North America in terms of their understanding of how much additives are actually in the food and how could it be impacting. But what they're suggesting is that, and this is sort of a worst case scenario based on their intake estimates, and I've just put in an 80 kilogram adult, is that it's only going to work out to about 337 milligrams of potassium per day if they're consuming sort of as many products as they possibly can with potassium sorbate. And so that may be a lot. It may not be a lot though. So it would depend a lot, I think, on how much your patients are having. But I do think that this is a signal that suggests that these additives or these foods with these additives may actually be minimal. And this is actually a really good thing for our patients because this has almost 50% of the additives for potassium or potassium sorbate. And we actually found a signal again in data that I looked at when we compared foods that contained potassium sorbate to foods that didn't have additives, that the potassium sorbate foods were actually lower in potassium on average than the foods that didn't contain a potassium additive. You might ask how adding an additive could lower the potassium content of a food, and part of that is likely that the potassium sorbate is going into foods that are naturally low in potassium because it's going into some of these processed foods that don't contain a lot versus we know that there is potassium in sort of fruits and vegetables and other things. But I think that this sort of tells me, at least at this point, I'm very careful about telling my patients that we think potassium sorbate is probably an additive of minimal concern if I'm talking to them about hyperkalemia. Acesulfame potassium was the second most prevalent additive. Acesulfame potassium is a sweetener and it's been around for a really long time. Our patients were often consuming acesulfame potassium way before we worried about any other potassium additive. It's only 20% potassium by weight. It does appear to be highly bioavailable. So in this study, they found that 98% of it was excreted and found in the urine. Although, again, when we look at use data of acesulfame potassium, use data actually suggests that it has little impact on the total amount of potassium that's being added in the diet. And even in our worst case scenario, when they do the modeling in Europe, so usually people who have diabetes who may be more likely to be choosing these sugar-free foods, yogurts, beverages, but they're still only sort of estimating about 144 milligrams per day of potassium coming from this. So again, when I'm talking to patients and they are looking for additives, I'm telling them that in most cases, likely acesulfame potassium is going to be okay. Although I will remember my colleague is in the room and she had a fellow who was eating an entire box of mints day in and day in and day in. And so of course it all is about moderation. So if somebody's consuming an entire box of mints every single day that contains acesulfame potassium, I'm not saying it can't add up, but I think in terms of regular use, provided your patients are consuming a variety of foods, acesulfame potassium is not likely to be the problem. So now these are the next ones, are problems. Potassium phosphate is, actually I love to focus on this one and I'm so glad it appears to be problematic because my patients are already restricting it for the phosphate, so I really love a 2-for-1. We're not talking about more additives, we're just talking like don't eat this one ever if you can. It's almost in 10% of foods. It was associated with significant increases in potassium and phosphorus for the record. And we don't have any data on it in terms of its action in food, but we do have some information about it as a medicine because it has been used in stones, so this Europhos potassium. And so it appears to be, at the very least, when it's given as a supplement or as a medicine, it appears to be highly bioavailable. That doesn't necessarily mean it remains highly bioavailable when we change the food matrix and put it into food. So that would be something that we need to study in the future, but it certainly is a signal that this is likely or has a high chance of being highly bioavailable. And we also have a signal that it will increase the potassium and phosphorus. So if you want your patients, or if you're worried about their potassium in their blood, then this would be one for them to be looking for, or for us to be looking for. One of the hard parts is potassium phosphate is in a whole bunch of foods, so I'm not going to read the slide. I just wanted you to have that there in case you're wondering where are these additives coming from. Potassium chloride, I think, is one that we're pretty familiar with. We've been talking a lot about it in terms of potassium salts for a long time. It's now also being added to foods. It's in almost 10% of foods. It's associated with huge jumps in the potassium content of food. In part also, this one is like a 50% by weight potassium, closer to. So you can see when they're adding it, it's just going to add that much more potassium. And actually, interestingly, we do have studies where they have looked at potassium chloride, they've added it to bread products and studied the bioavailability, and it appears to be highly bioavailable in these forms. So potassium chloride, we've actually been talking about it for a long time, and we can continue to talk about it with our patients. Hopefully, we're not telling them anything wrong there. It's starting to be added into a whole bunch of foods. And actually, one of the things that I was looking for, because whereas in both Canada and the US, we have sodium reformulation guidelines. And so our governments are asking our food manufacturers to please reduce the sodium content of your food. But in terms of ultra-processed food, it's not as easy as just, okay, I'm just gonna like make my tomato soup and not add the salt and everything's gonna be good to go. Because salt does a lot of things in foods, including preservation, including taste. And so in both Canadian and American guidelines, the governments are recommending switching out sodium chloride for potassium chloride. And so we're likely going to see the use of potassium chloride increase. There is a signal that whenever a food is marketed as a reduced salt food, that it is more likely to contain the potassium chloride, although there's also a signal that this is in all kinds of foods. So getting your patient only to look for reduced salt on the label is likely not enough to get them to avoid potassium chloride, unfortunately. Wouldn't that be so easy if you could just say, like, don't buy those ones and then you'll be good to go? Unfortunately, it's not that easy, but certainly anything that's being labeled as reduced specifically. So not naturally low, not naturally unsalted like those other claims, but reduced sodium is the sort of the tag that you want your patients to be looking for and being careful of. Potassium citrate was another really common additive. It's about 38% potassium, although it comes in some different forms, so sometimes it's less. It was associated with an increase in potassium content, although less jump than the other two. It is considered highly bioavailable, and you can see where it is there. And this is actually one I'm noticing in my clinical practice coming up, and actually I'll show you why I think this might be a bit of a problem, is because it's being found in a lot of beverages. And so anytime my patients are consuming a lot of ultra-processed beverages, which I'm going to show you some data that says that our patients love ultra-processed beverages, so I'm seeing potassium citrate come up, and this is one in clinical practice that I'm feeling like my patients need to be aware of, and when they watch for it, they are seeing improvements in their serum levels. Potassium lactate is used in about 5% of foods. We have so little data on potassium lactate that I could find nothing whatsoever about its bioavailability. It's about 30% potassium. And one of the reasons that potassium lactate is being used is because it helps to control microbial growth in meat. So anytime your patient is having a meat product that's processed, that's where you're going to be kind of having your little spider sense out of, does this product potentially contain potassium lactate? And you know, it's easy to really demonize additives. I remember, like, when I started my PhD, I was like, oh my gosh, processed food is horrible and these additives are horrible. But I guess the flip side is that these additives help keep our food safe, and there's a reason they're putting it in there. It's really effective at controlling listeria, and we don't want our patients to get listeria. So I guess it's in there for a reason, even though if it's perhaps not good. But you're going to see lactate is really concentrated in those meat products because that's what it's doing in the food. Okay, so quick summary then of which potassium additive do you think is going to be less likely to impact serum potassium levels? Oh, maybe I need to click to show the answer. There we go. Yeah, you're right. Yes, yay. And I mean, if that's the only thing that you take away, that potassium sorbate maybe is okay for our patients, so we're not accidentally restricting more than we need to do, then I think that this is actually a win, because we really, at least for me, I just don't want my patients to have to eat any less already than they possibly could be doing. So those are our big takeaways. Ones that increase, we think there's some with minimal, and then potassium lactate, I have a probable increase because all signs points to increase, although we have one of the least studied, the least amount of data on this additive at this point. So let's talk about phosphorus additives. This is a really interesting one, actually, because the phosphorus additives, this was just released by Mona Calvo, another famous phosphorus researcher, and this was data that she used up until 2020, but this just came out in March this year. So this was a pretty exciting study. She used food purchasing data to do her analysis, so that's really an interesting way. It's nice because it means she's capturing foods that people are likely buying in terms of getting popular foods. But what she found was 56% of foods contained a phosphorus additive. This is probably not shocking, but it does mean like 1 in 2 foods that our patients are picking up off of a shelf, if they're ultra processed, likely contains a phosphorus additive. And these are the top additives that she found. And there were many products that contained 0 to 8, with 21% containing more than 1 phosphorus additive. So I guess basically this is describing, I would say, a big problem in the sense that there's additives in so much of the ultra-processed food, because again, remembering that if our patients choose minimally processed food, these foods don't contain additives. But let's talk about the actual additives. So you could see there that lecithin was the most common additive, and it's really high, but do our patients need to avoid it? So let's see what we can find out. And so this was, again, work that I did where I was trying to figure out how are the different additives appearing, what types of foods are they appearing in, and how often are they going to have both a phosphorus additive. And phosphorus is sort of, I think of our classic phosphorus additives that I think we've been teaching our patients for a long time to avoid, anything that says PHOS in the label, FOS, don't eat that. But lecithin and some of these other ones are not ones that we've traditionally included on our patient handouts. But again, before we go out there and add it all on, let's make sure we need to, and so we'll get there. But yeah, there are different patterns in terms of the types of additives across the foods. And so phosphorus additives are added during food processing. They can be a phosphate salt, but there are other compounds containing phosphorus, including the ribonucleides and lecithin. And actually, so Dr. Calvo's list, when they were doing this audit, she looked for, I think it was about 277, I may have miscounted, as you can appreciate, that's a long list. But 277 search terms for phosphorus additives. So that was actually the most comprehensive list of phosphorus additives that I have ever seen. And that's what she was looking at. So it's not, phosphorus additives, if we're talking, aren't just calcium phosphate. And so this was one list actually. So this, I made this slide before Dr. Calvo's paper came out, but because prior to her paper, I would say that this was the most comprehensive list I'd ever found. And this was over 35 in Europe. But like I said, she blew that out of the water on March 6th when she gave us a list of 277. So do they need to avoid them all? Because we have signals that there are different types of salts found in different types of foods. And so let's talk a little bit about that. And so this is just an example of what your patients might be seeing. This is certainly an example of what our patients are seeing. So it's in Rice Krispies as ferric phosphate. It's in the almond milk as tricalcium phosphate. And phosphorus is not mandatory on the label in Canada or in the States. Do you ever see it though? Yeah, right. Okay. I was wondering, I was talking to someone who wasn't a dietitian and they were like, no, it's never there. And I'm like, really, in Canada, sometimes. Yeah, sometimes you see it. Yeah, same in Canada. Very little is known about phosphorus in food. So this is again looking at the USDA branded product database of almost 240,000 food items. Only 1.4% actually reported how much phosphorus was in their food. So it's actually a really big black hole, worse than potassium, although I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in terms of how much phosphorus is in the food source. But what we were finding is that there appears to be a pattern especially with those phosphorus salts. So not surprisingly, when you see potassium phosphate in food, both the potassium and phosphorus go up. When you see calcium phosphate in food, both the calcium and phosphorus go up. Sodium, iron, same thing. Do you guys notice or see something that's kind of cool about these co-nutrients with the phosphorus? Is calcium on your label? Sometimes. It's not mandatory? Mandatory, right? Iron? It's calcium's mandatory in Canada. That's why I'm like, really not. Iron, also mandatory. So potassium becoming mandatory, although there's legs. But this was sort of an interesting thing for me. I was really excited when I started to notice this, that we're seeing, again, not really surprising, but I'd never sort of seen it laid out that way, that when we increase phosphorus, both minerals, whichever it's sort of partnered with, are increasing. And so we could, if we wanted to, really get into the nitty-gritty and try to figure out then how much phosphorus is being added into our food. So this was an example of a orange juice that has calcium phosphate in it. So in Canada, and I'm assuming in the States, a lot of people perhaps are buying this orange juice that's fortified with calcium as a source of calcium. And in most cases, a lot of times, calcium phosphate is the fortification of choice. But if we go into the periodic table, we can actually look up what the compound tricalcium phosphate is, and we can figure out how much of that by weight is calcium, is phosphorus, and is oxygen, whatever is in that. And then we can work backwards, especially if the food is naturally low in calcium, where we can make an assumption. Orange juice is probably almost 0 or 40 milligrams. You could look up what a non-fortified calcium source is in your orange juice, and you can actually work backwards to figure out, okay, well, if you've added 330 milligrams of calcium from tricalcium phosphate in your serving, then that means that by default, you must have then added 181 milligrams of phosphorus into your serving. And so then if this is an important product for your patient, you can then decide, is this a product that my patient can consume safely, or is this a product that my patient perhaps shouldn't be consuming safely because it's adding a significant amount? And so I think we have a little bit of time, and I thought maybe it would be kind of fun. I'm hoping that these links will work. This is one that has come up for me, is that my patients love Rice Krispies. It's naturally low in potassium. It's on all the old food lists as like a perfect cereal for them to be having. But now it's got ferric phosphate in it. And so my patients have been eating this for the last 20 years. They love it. Do they need to stop buying their favorite breakfast cereal? And so this is sort of one of those ones where you can kind of go and take a look, and you can view the smart label. This is sort of how I would do this, and I will take a look at the ingredient list. Okay, so it has iron phosphate. Ferric phosphate is being added to Rice Krispies, so now my patient is wondering, is it still safe for me to eat this? And so then I can take a look and I can say, okay, well, it has 5.5 milligrams of iron in it. So now I can actually go back and do some math, which I will do for us, and you can do too. So if it has 5.5 milligrams per serving of iron phosphate, then, oh, I want to go back. Uh-oh. I've ruined the tech. But then we can go and take a look at the websites. Oh, sorry, guys. This was so much slicker when I did it at home and was able to like go back and forth. I really knocked your socks off when I practiced without you being here.
You can only see your slides anyway.
Oh, you can only see the slides. Oh, you never got to see the Rice Krispie. Oh, okay. So then actually, so if we can only see the slides, now I can't see the slides. Isn't that funny? Okay, but yeah, so you can actually work your way through. So you can go into your product label. My patient's asking me about Rice Krispies. Then I can go and I can take a look at the smart label. I can figure out that it has 5.5 milligrams of iron in it. Now I have to sort of really scratch my brain and like get out my old solve for X. But I did learn this and I can do it. It's not easy, but I can do it. So I can look it up, the product details in the US FDA. And the reason you can start there is you can figure out if the product didn't contain phosphorus from iron, what would it be? So does rice actually contain any iron? And you can figure out that actually it's got very little, or you can kind of do the math. And then you can go to PubChem and you can look up the structure of iron phosphate, and you can use the molecular weights to figure out exactly how much iron and phosphate is being added, and you can go back and do the math. And you will be happy to know that if we had done that, that the amount of phosphorus that's being added is actually very low. And so provided your patient is consuming a reasonable amount of Rice Krispies, this actually becomes a product that contains a phosphorus additive that might be safe for them to eat. And again, I don't necessarily do this for every food or for every patient, but I do think that especially when we're dealing with a patient maybe who has malnutrition, or maybe a patient who has low socioeconomic status, or maybe a patient who is just really struggling with their quality of life and they just love starting their day with their Rice Krispies, it's really nice to be able to, I guess, make that precision or make that individualized nutrition and say, well, let's look at the product you're buying, let's do a little bit of math, and we can actually figure this out and see if this is okay for you or not. And I think that if we can do that, and it's nice that we can, then this does give our patients some opportunity to perhaps include foods if they're meaningful for them. Okay, so you guys still see the slides. Here we go. Okay, so what? So yeah, so products that are highly fortified with calcium, potassium, sodium, and iron will also have concurrent increases in phosphorus intake. So those two minerals go up together. The more they're adding of calcium, the higher you're seeing those numbers grow. Likely, not surprisingly, the more the phosphorus. And you can figure it out for your patient if that matters to them. But what about the other phosphorus additives? So this is actually a little shot from the poster that I have downstairs. I had 2 incredible master's students working with me this year, and we collected grocery store receipts of our patients who come to our clinic to understand how much additives they might be getting into and what types of additives are they actually consuming. Because it's nice to look at general population data, but it's also really nice to know exactly what our patients who are living with CKD and being seen by myself, a dietitian, so this is educated population, what were they actually doing? And so we found that almost 50% of the foods they purchased contained an additive likely of concern, and the top additives were coming from snacks and ready-to-eat foods when it comes to phosphate. And what we also found was that the disodium guanylate, disodium inosate, and lecithin were some of the most common additives that contain phosphorus that they were getting into. And again, on that idea of, well, but does that matter? Do I actually care? And if you think about Dr. Calvo's study where lecithin was the most common phosphorus additive, this sort of sends me down the rabbit hole of, is lecithin a concern for my patient? So lecithin is only 4% by weight phosphorus. So we're starting out actually, first signal is good. It's not a really high phosphorus food. It's used as an emulsifier, wetting agent, viscosity, release agent, crystallization control. That's why it's in everything, because it does a lot of really good things. This, again, isn't actually something that I want to go through. I just wanted you to have it here and so that you could go back. This was from a study, or not a study, a review in sort of food science in terms of how much lecithin is being added to food, where and why. And so the article provided the amounts and the percentage. And so then I've kind of worked out some of these other amounts so that I could figure out then how much lecithin could be added to food. And this is your key takeaway, is that some foods, because of the way lecithin is being used, appear to add a lot of lecithin to it. So when you've got doughs, you've got breads, flatbreads, cookies, crackers, confectionery, so those are adding a little. So if those products contain lecithin and your patient is eating them, they're likely okay for your patient to continue eating, provided they're consuming them in moderate amounts. That being said, if your patient is eating cakes and donuts that contain lecithin, protein bars or protein drinks that contain lecithin, cocoa powders or instant powdered products, those appear to be have a lot of lecithin added to them. So these could be problematic. This makes it a really difficult patient education strategy because we can't really consistently say, if it says lecithin on the label, please put it back. But again, I guess this is where we can strive as much as we can to individualize the message, doing that diet history and understand if phosphorus is a concern, what are you consuming? And then perhaps giving them really targeted approaches of, this is what we think you probably need to avoid, but this is what we think you can actually probably safely still consume. Again, though, I think it depends, because I will tell you again, in the clinical practice, I had a patient who ate 3 sandwiches every single day. That was like her life. A sandwich for breakfast, a sandwich for lunch, and sandwich for supper, and maybe a piece of toast before bed. Does anybody else have patients like this sometimes? And so she was consuming a bread product that contained lecithin, and we switched it out for her. So even though technically that bread was adding a little, we would anticipate, we switched her bread out to one that didn't contain lecithin, and her phosphorus went down significantly. So I do think that in her case, if you have somebody who's consuming a lot of something, then it's possible that that could be the culprit. But so it's worth digging. But in general, if you just have a 2 pieces of toast kind of person, they're probably okay with a little bit of lecithin in their bread. What about disodium guanylate? So again, this was one that was also talked about in Dr. Calvo's study. So this one is coming up as a really common phosphorus additive. It's one that my patients probably can't say. And so before I tell them that they need to be reading it, I want to make sure that this is a problem. It's only 7.6% by weight phosphorus. It's approved for use as a flavoring agent. There are no limits and very little use data in either the US or in Europe. Europe is the only sort of global, well, I should say I looked at North America and Europe. I looked at those 2. Canada, US, we don't have any recommendations, but Europe does set a limit on it. And so I guess the easy answer is we don't know. I don't know. I can't tell you with any degree of comfort that it's either high or low in terms of how much it's impacting. But fortunately, because it is a low phosphorus content, it's not going to be one that I'm going to add onto my patient handouts at this point. Disodium inosate is again another one that was common. It was common among our patients, common in Dr. Calvo's study. It's 7.9% phosphorus. It is approved for use with more things, so you're probably going to see it because the more things an additive is approved in, the more chances it'll be in more foods. And again, though, there's very little in terms of legislation or use data. So I'm not quite ready to add it to my handouts, but I suppose it's one that I'm going to keep in my back pocket. And if I start to hear, if I'm really struggling with someone in their phosphorus and I'm worried, this may be one that I might need to dig into just because of its commonality. Ooh. Okay, so this is a ranking one, a poll. So sort of with all of these things in mind, let's rank these foods from highest to lowest phosphate bioavailability. Yeah. So your cola beverage with phosphoric acid, I totally agree. It's liquid, so the food matrix in the stomach would suggest that it's going to be easy for the body to absorb. It's got that phosphoric acid, so we think it's probably going to be high. We've got our store-bought muffin with sodium phosphate, so again, we think that that's probably going to, those additives are likely bioavailable. If it's a processed brand product, then probably the phytates have been removed. Next up would be that Raisin Bran cereal, so again, it's a processed grain product. It may not contain an additive, but it likely is still going to be more bioavailable than the minimally processed brown rice, just sort of based on all of these things. But I will tell you that we haven't a single study done where we've compared them all. So this is just my best guess. So the sort of last overarching topic that I want to talk about is the accuracy of potassium and phosphorus reporting, because I think one of the things that we are struggling with in science and as clinicians is understanding just how much of these minerals our patients are eating. And I don't know if you guys are noticing this in your practice all the time. So this is a product that a patient brought to me. They have started, they have high potassium, but it's really good because they're starting to read labels, and they've switched to this great tomato sauce that contains 0 milligrams of potassium. They are good to go. Except if you read the ingredient list, the very first ingredient is tomato paste. And I'm not trying to call out Campbell's soup. I'm just saying that there's a problem. There's no way this product contains 0 milligrams of potassium. And until I started seeing this, I really did think to myself, like, how is this possible? These are real labels that a patient brought into me. And like, our patients try so hard. So like, all of my patients are working so hard on at least one of the things. This isn't about potassium. And maybe this is a little bit hard to see, but basically this person was buying different types of sockeye salmon. He's really concerned about his protein. He wants to make sure he's getting just the right amount. And he noticed that in this one wild sockeye salmon, which only is wild sockeye salmon, it has 11 grams of protein and 55 grams. And this other one only had, where is it here? Can you see it? 20. Protein, 20. Yeah, so 20 grams in the exact same. And so he literally is bringing this into my room with him, like our clinical, and he's like, how is this possible? And I think that the answer is the labels are wrong. One of these labels is not like the other. One of these labels is wrong. So how can this be happening? Like, as a dietitian, I always thought that our labels were right. Maybe I was naive. I was naive, actually. That's the moral of the story. I was naive. They're not right. But it wasn't something I actually realized. And so, or even understood the sort of the gravity of the concern until I started doing this. So this was within the USDA branded product database as I was going through these food items that were reporting potassium and also phosphorus content. What I was noticing is that there were all kinds of foods that were reporting reasonably low amounts of potassium. Like, that's not possible that that tomato paste-based product has 0 milligrams of potassium. It also wasn't always possible that this, 30-gram serving of a dried apricot contains 6,000 milligrams of potassium. Like, it doesn't even have 6,000 like by weight. Like, it's not 100% potassium. So there was incredible misreporting being out there for potassium. The same was true about phosphorus, and I found this really fascinating when I looked at it. This is sort of a heat map of the reporting, and what this is showing you is the number of times a product reported a specific phosphorus value. And so it was like 109 products all were reporting 88 milligrams. I was like, what is happening? Like, why is there this pulse of 88 milligrams? And so then when you kind of like take a closer look at the data, you can see that these are two different types of yogurt. One says it has calcium phosphate. The other one doesn't contain calcium phosphate, but they're reporting the exact same amount of phosphorus. Like, how is that possible? How can you be taking a dairy product which should contain similar amounts of phosphorus, adding extra phosphorus to it, and not changing the phosphorus content? And so then I started to dig into, okay, well, where does this information actually come from? This is on our nutrient databases. Canada uses American, so it's not like we're okay in Canada and you've got a problem. In fact, we just take everything from you guys in the USDA and just put it in our own. We just, change the .gov.ca, So like we have problems in Canada too. And so the USDA actually maintains these different levels of databases. And so there's these foundational foods, where those ones are tested within a lab. Then they also have the standard reference legacy, which they're no longer updating. But again, these are lab-derived sort of values. On top of that, they also have their food and nutrient database for dietary studies. So any study that is using the ASA 24, using the DHQ, like using some of these sort of what would be considered rigorous diet research methods, they are using this database to understand how much potassium and phosphorus is in it, but you can see that it only has 7,000 food items. So there is going to be things that our patients are consuming that maybe, for example, they might be consuming the yogurt with calcium phosphate, but it's only going to default to the yogurt without calcium phosphate. So we don't actually have this super comprehensive database, considering there's over 240,000 food items in the 2018 version. It's now over 1 billion. I'm going to need a new computer to update the study. Like, my computer can't handle it. So there's different levels, and we have so many foods available, and we really just don't have good chemical analysis of the majority, the overwhelming majority of the foods. And so neither the FDA or Health Canada has stated how a company needs to determine the nutrient content of their products for labeling purposes. So they do say you are allowed to do a direct analysis, so you can take your yogurt to the lab and get it analyzed for calcium and phosphorus, but you are also allowed to do an indirect analysis, which means you could use a nutrient database to look up each and every ingredient. But you can also compare your product to a similar product and take their label information and put it on your label and say, great, they're yogurt, I'm yogurt, good to go. 88 milligrams of phosphorus. And I think, like, there's a benefit to that. Like, there's two sides to every story. We don't necessarily want every single one of our foods to be produced by PepsiCo, who has the money to chemically analyze their food. We actually want small food producers to be able to produce food for us. And if we were to say to every single food producer, you must analyze your food, you must analyze it in triplicate, and I want you to do it 4 times a year in case there's seasonal variability in terms of what your cows are eating. And so sometimes it's going higher or lower because the grass is greener in the summer, which is going to impact the final mineral content of their food. It would be cost prohibitive. It wouldn't enable, which is already a market saturated with not enough competition, but it would really make it very challenging on our food industry. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is a bad system. There's a reason why this is there. And it also means that I am highly suspicious of problems. And it also means that if we have a tomato product saying 0 milligrams, another company could theoretically come around and say, well, great, my product is your product, and so mine also has 0 milligrams of potassium, when in fact it does not. And I will tell you that within the USDA, not a single value that was reported, this is their branded product database for potassium and phosphorus, was a direct measure. Every single one that is reported in that database is an indirect measure. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm highly suspicious that we've got significant problems, and likely it's underreporting, and likely it's going to disproportionately impact our ultra-processed food, because the truth is that our minimally processed food might be changing a little bit in the potassium content, like maybe the banana from Ecuador is slightly different than the banana from another part of the world or from like that farm over there. But actually it's probably much more stable versus when we take a product and add potassium to it, it's likely going to have a bigger change in terms of what we're seeing there. And so not surprisingly, there is evidence that suggests that the nutrient databases don't do a great job when we compare it to a lab analysis. And so again, looking at ones that don't contain additives, they're doing okay. They were kind of within 38. But the second we start to add additives in, we're seeing significant levels of underreporting, which is really problematic for our patients, for ourselves, trying to figure out what food is high or low. But it also, I think, is a challenge to the scientific community, because when we are looking at studies that are then reporting potassium and phosphorus content using nutrient databases, those nutrient databases could be significantly underreporting, which makes it really difficult for us to look at a study that's comparing intake with an outcome, because do we believe that that outcome is in fact true, especially couched in the fact that over 50% of our patients' calories are coming from these ultra-processed food. So this isn't a small amount of the diet, this is a huge amount of the diet, and we really don't know how much mineral content is in there, and if anything, it's likely higher, probably higher, especially once it's got an additive. And so same thing, that was phosphorus, this is potassium, and again, we're seeing changes. It's not matching once there's an additive in it. And so that does come down a little bit to accuracy reporting. So what is the standard? So I've already told you that they're allowed to take an indirect measure, but then you might think, well, okay, so they take it, but then it's wrong, and then don't they get in trouble because they're wrong? And unfortunately, in neither Canada or the US is that the case. In both Canada and the US, we have one-sided limits. And unfortunately, the limit for potassium and phosphorus falls on the wrong side for us. So both, depending on how this product is being used, potassium and phosphorus will fall in either a class 1 or a class 2. And you can see class 1 nutrients, the mean nutrient content, it cannot be less than the declared value. So what that means is that 0 milligrams of potassium is correct because it's not less than 300. You're good to go. It actually falls within the one-sided limit. So our labeling laws and legislation are such that underreporting is okay, but it does mean for our patients, and I will tell you in my clinical practice, I am very hesitant to get my patients to read labels for potassium because I worry it's just not accurate enough. I do tell them if it's high, it's almost certainly high because I know it's not going to be less than that, but just because it's low doesn't mean it's actually low. And in fact, I worry that in some ways this one-sided limit has actually made life harder for our patients, not easier, because they get this false sense of security that they're buying this 0 milligram containing potassium tomato sauce, when in fact it's 300, and then they eat, a whole bunch of it thinking that everything is okay. So this, I think, is unfortunately hugely problematic, and for all of us to continue advocating, not just for these values to be on our labels, but they need to be accurate enough to do what we need them to do for our patients and for ourselves. So in summary, ultra-processed foods can be significant sources of both potassium and phosphorus. There is a signal that some additives are more bioavailable and will have a larger impact, but we really don't know. And that the truth is, part of the reason we don't know is not only are there not studies, but even when we do have it reported, I worry that those values are not accurate enough to actually sort of help our patients to the way that we need. I'm just going to do a soft plug. There is a low potassium diet practice pattern study that's being done on a global scale from Dr. Andrew Morris and Dr. Kelly Lambert. I'm sort of helping lead the North American arm. So if you are interested in sharing anything about your dietary low potassium diet study, then feel free to participate there. That's the little plug. And then I will open it up if anybody has questions. I haven't checked time. Hopefully I'm okay.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was fascinating. And I feel like really helps us bring more nuance to this ultra-processed foods conversation. Like, I feel like they're getting demonized to a fault, right? Like, we're sure, we know people who eat more ultra-processed foods have bad outcomes, blah, blah, blah. But like, canned beans are good. Whole grain crackers are good, right? Like, there's just so much nuance, and this is like a whole nother level of nuance in addition. So thank you. Annabelle.
Kelly, fantastic presentation. So you mentioned that you were, for your PhD, talking also with agricultural folks. So I was wondering if one of the things that, at least from what I've heard, in pigs, what they do is add phytase in order to liberate some of the phosphorus, so it does not go into as pollution. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you had any conversations on what is the impact of that into the phosphorus content of those pigs that are receiving that phytase that may be enhancing probably the phosphorus content.
Yeah, so I can't say that I know the answer to this question, but yeah, I mean, ultimately, when we're modifying any type of food, it's likely going to have a downstream impact on the meat that people are eating. And it's really interesting because, yeah, from a food science perspective, a lot of times they're actually looking at, and especially in animal feed, at improving the bioaccessibility of these nutrients, which likely has a downstream sort of impact on our meat. Although interestingly, when they do look at, like, for example, that phosphorus study, where they looked at comparing the lab analyzed meat to the nutrient database, they did actually still find it to be less. So I think probably more to come, but I think and that just also sort of speaks to it's not quite so simple for food producers to just put a number on the label, because it probably depends on what did that pig eat and where did you buy the feed and how bioaccessible was the phosphorus in the feed. Like, this is sort of something that it hadn't really occurred to me sort of before I did all of this work. Like, it just felt like, well, banana has 322 milligrams of potassium, obviously, but it doesn't, or we don't know, and there's going to be variability, and there's likely going to be changes over time, and it probably depends on, the sun exposure, what was fertilized, and then, when you talk about animal, what are they eating? So it's really complicated to actually understand how much of a nutrient is in our food.
Yeah.
Hi, great presentation, by the way. I just have a question going back to the bioavailability of potassium and phosphorus in whole. As we saw earlier, several food groups, single foods or categories of foods. But in my non-scientific brain, I'm trying to think if you combine foods. So you have foods that are, say, high of bioavailability versus low, and you combine foods, say like a nice green leafy salad with, say, your store-bought dressing on that. I mean, is it continually additive, or is there some benefit to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is such a great question, and it kind of like gets to the heart of like, these answers we don't know, but it's hard to imagine that it doesn't have an impact. And certainly, like, one of the things I think that's going to change and that I'm really excited about is some new technology coming out. So there is, for example, like, potassium sensors are starting to be tested, which is basically like a glucose sensor for potassium. And because we do certainly understand that within a glucose metabolism, right? Like, we don't think that every gram of carbohydrate is exactly the same. And there's things like glycemic index and food matrix that we think are having an impact on how much of that glucose is then getting into the bloodstream and then into the cell. And I think that, I've kind of just focused on the food part. I haven't actually necessarily gotten it all into all of the pieces that are going to have an impact on the serum level. But I think it's absolutely possible that how people are eating in that matrix, and that's probably why we saw, for example, like in those combined studies where they were looking at kind of food as a whole, that there was a difference in the bioavailability versus if you just pulse somebody with a huge dose of potato. Like it's different. As humans, mostly we are eating complex meals. So anyways, I guess that's a whole long answer of saying I don't know, but I am really excited about when that potassium sensor technology comes out. And I think it will be a lot easier for us to understand some of the curves and actually the true response of a food product to on the serum level. Yeah.
It's fast. It just like even more feels so silly to tell a patient to eat a certain amount of potassium or phosphorus or any nutrient for that matter, because like it's going to be so different based on where it's coming from, what they're eating. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I was chatting with another dietitian as part of this potassium implementation study. And, like I remember, like so I graduated in 2008, I interned in 2007, sort of like back in that day, it was the 2003 KDOQI guidelines were the guidelines that we referred to. And at that time, like low potassium diets, it was, 2,000 to 4,000 milligrams across the board for anybody 3 to 5. And we didn't care what was happening with your potassium levels. And it was like every milligram of potassium was considered exactly the same. And I think that we've learned so much since then, and like 1 milligram of potassium is not likely the same for so many reasons. Not just like the food factors, the meal factors, the time of day factors, and then patient factors too. So this like straight shot of you eat 2,000 milligrams of potassium, your potassium is going to be 5.7 is no longer so linear.
All right, we have a lot of good questions in the app, so we're going to start going through them. Maybe you can't answer this, but do potassium and phosphorus binders bind additives equally? As the same as naturally, do you know?
I have no idea. I'm looking at David. We've got
any thoughts
famous
from the audience?
researcher. Yeah, don't know that there's ever been a study done.
I've looked and I've never found anything. So it's possible it's been done, but I've never been able to find it. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it has been done.
If you come to my next talk at noon, put the plug in. I will go over what we know in terms of how much phosphorus is being bound. And because I guess part of me also thinks a little bit like, a phosphorus binder is binding 39 milligrams of phosphorus. It's like a teeny tiny amount compared to the actual load of the phosphorus that could be in a meal.
I think one thing that I can say is that the potassium binders are misnamed, and we wrote a paper about
Yes.
and you don't take them with your meals like a phosphate binder. So we can say, at least from a potassium perspective, it probably no, because it's not working that way. But for the phosphate binders, I have not found anything. So I just wanted to clarify that because it was a dual-part question.
Right. Yeah. We don't take, in Canada, we only have KX-Salate on our formulary. Can I even say that out loud and not embarrass myself? But yeah, it's not like binding in that traditional sense.
There's a question about sharing your slides, and you did. They are available in the app, so you can get them there.
Yeah, you bet, because actually most of the information I think is for you for the slides so that you can go back and take a look at some of those numbers and where the foods are so that you can hopefully help to figure it out for your patient when you've got these tough values.
It's a lot of information in there, so thank you for sharing. What about binders like Tums that have calcium phos as an ingredient?
Yeah, I know. This is like quite an interesting thing. I can tell you there's been lots of information sort of coming out about the phosphorus load that's from our medications. And there was actually a recent study, that it's up around 300 milligrams, depending on what's there. There's phosphorus loads coming from our food. There's phosphorus loads coming from medications that we're taking. Effectively, I think we do know that like calcium phosphate in the Tums is binding. And actually that was one of David St. Jules' hypothesis in terms of why were we not seeing necessarily 100% bioavailability from these phosphorus additives, is perhaps there's actually binding on the additives before it's even being digested and absorbed. So like of that calcium phosphate, like why did they not show 100%? Could these actually be binding even within our digestive tract, which again sort of brings it back to is like 1 milligram is not 1 milligram is not 1 milligram. There's likely a lot going on, but it's sort of something more for us to study and more to come.
I think this question is sort of an opportunity for you to sort of clarify your final message here. So the question is, what are you educating patients on if it's not recommending to restrict natural sources or added sources of potassium and phosphorus?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, first is always to do the assessment. And then if I'm deciding that it is diet related, then I'm going to look for the additives first. And I'm going to be looking for like potassium chloride, potassium phosphate, potassium citrate, and potassium lactate first. Now, I mean, obviously this is always couched within my patient and what they're eating. So like my patient that eats a bologna and Kraft single sandwich 3 times a day, and that is his diet. And even if we get him free vegetables, like it's never been part of his food and it's just never going to be him. I think we can all think of people that we have like that, right? So, you know, that might look a little bit different than someone else who maybe has more opportunity. But so I will always, I guess, try to like focus on what I would describe as expendable foods first. So foods that are less nutritious, and trying to get those out or get them switched out for something that is more nutritious, that likely is maybe still has potassium but is lower. And then the other actually strategy that I use a lot, that my patients actually really like, it was one of the ones that we did again in my PhD, was soaking and wet cooking methods. We did this, we kind of developed like a quick and easy protocol where we had patients soaking foods just in hot water from the boil for about 10 minutes if it was harder food, and 5 minutes if it was softer food. We got them to do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like we had them soak bananas, we had them soak tomatoes, we had them soak beans, we had them soak chicken, we had them soak fish. And our goal was to develop a protocol that was like quick and easy. Like you don't have to pre-boil, you don't have to do it for a long time, you just need hot water. And we were seeing reductions in both potassium and phosphorus and collateral nutrient losses, which I know is a question that comes up. But we were seeing reductions by as much as like 10 to 20%, which like can actually sort of help if we're just kind of looking to like adjust a little bit. And so while I don't have a ton of patients at home soaking bananas, I do actually think that this is a strategy that a lot of patients actually are open to. And especially, like I say, I felt good about that protocol that we developed because it was really patient focused in mind, and trying to make it easier. And I do have patients that are willing to like pre-soak their bacon slices for 10 minutes before they fry it in the morning because it's important to them and they want to have it. And if I can include it, I feel like that is my job. Like what food is important to you and how can I help you include it in a way that fits with everything else that you're juggling and what your health goals are. So I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Someone's interested if you reached out to Campbell's.
Right? You know, I didn't reach out to Campbell's or that salmon company. But yeah, I know. I mean, sometimes it feels like, where do we begin? And I will say, like, ASN is sort of working, and like the FDA did recently put out that call for feedback. And so, I mean, I guess as much as we can, I guess talking about it, one, so that we're all aware of it, and then sort of doing what we can in terms of advocating both at the, I think it's also like at a legislation level, because the truth is that Campbell's isn't in violation of the law. Like they are compliant with the labeling law. That's sort of one of the things. So I do actually think we probably would, like in Europe and a lot of things, they actually have a 2-sided limit. So I think it's okay to say that it may not be 100%, right? Because of all the variability. But what would be really awesome is to say, okay, it needs to be though, like plus minus 20% or something like that. Like it needs to fall in a window. Like 0 to 300 isn't okay. I will say actually one of the things I'm working on in Canada, we call it FOIPing, so Freedom of Information So Canada does do some testing. I don't know if they do in America at the USDA labs, where they actually go and like do compliance testings for the labels. And so I actually did get data from Canada, which I'm sort of in the process of working on analyzing to understand like how compliant are we in terms of potassium, and sort of how much testing are our governments actually doing, and what are they reporting out in terms of compliance for labels. So that'll be interesting work, and I'm sort of excited to, I actually was hoping that I would have maybe some early data I could share with you, but I couldn't put it together in time. But these are all sorts of, I think, studies that can be done. And if somebody wants to do that here in America, I think we should. And I could help you a little bit with it. FOIP your government, or whatever you might call it here.
Well, hopefully we have any sort of regulation. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think maybe some clarifying questions on how in the world the USDA database gets all those numbers from all those different categories of things. So the question is, how are the values indirect values, or how are all the values indirect values in the USDA database? Doesn't one have to be direct?
Well, so that was the branded product database. I'm sorry, that was a clarifying question. So yes, you're right. If the food was from so when you go to the USDA Food Data Central, there's all those different tabs where you can look up the data from. So if you're looking in the legacy or in the foundational food, that's where you're going to be seeing sort of more of those lab derived, and they'll tell you when was it lab derived, what were the triplicate samples. You often tend to see a more comprehensive nutrient profile on those foods. One of the things that is tough about that is a lot of times they're actually generic foods, and they're often not brand specific. But if we're trying to dig into additives, we often do need the level of brand, which is where then a lot of times you're going to go to the USDA branded product database, because you want to look up your patient's yogurt, like you want to know about that one. And so in those cases, none of the values, at least in the 2018 version, that were available within that USDA database were a direct value.
One last question that I might be able to help with. So with so much emphasis on avoiding natural and organic sources of potassium and phosphorus on handouts, do you have any recommendations for handouts that patients that emphasize avoiding these additives?
I'll put in a plug for BC Renal.
The Renal Practice Group also within the Academy has a lot of really great handouts as well. And there's RD to RD, well-resourced RD has patient handouts that dietitians have created that sell to other dietitians. I know that there's a lot of really great stuff on there too. So yeah. they exist. You just got to hunt a little bit.
Yeah. And actually, like the BC Renal one, I think is like become, at least in Canada, sort of our most sort of well-used resource. I actually didn't make that handout, so shout out to those people who did. But it does really try to shift the focus off of those minimally processed foods and starting with like, let's talk about your hot chocolate powder and your tomato juice and your canned soups and your sports drinks first.
Any other questions from the audience? Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly. This was fascinating.
Thank you.